Good morning. Welcome to this introduction to the fourth lessons about major mobility global challenges. How come Politecnico decided to include mobility among the 6 global challenges? Well, you had a first introductory class by Professor Sachs showing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 UN. Now, if we look at these goals, the majority of these 17 goals are more or less impacted by mobility. And here in red, you can see the goals where mobility has a greater impact. Well, undoubtedly, number 11, sustainable cities and communities, infrastructure. Number 9, life on Earth, protecting ecosystems, climate change. Now, if we looked at the overwhelming majority of them, well, most of them are directly linked to mobility. So what does it mean that mobility has an impact on these 17 Sustainable Development Goals? When can it be considered sustainable? Now, the early definitions of sustainable mobility, dating back to the 90s, applied the more general definition of sustainable development from the Grandi report, centered on an intergenerational approach to mobility concepts in general. Therefore, a sustainable mobility system, as you can read here, meets the mobility needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own mobility needs. Although it's not that easy to understand if and how these needs will change compared to the present time. Then, over time, this definition became more and more complex based on the 3 pillars of sustainability, i.e., the environmental, the economic, and the social dimension. Therefore, a mobility system can be considered sustainable when, on the one hand, it meets people's needs to access interaction opportunities at work, for leisure, for shopping, scattered in the area, so in an equitable way, without too much difference between people living in different places. It is affordable. It offers choice of transport mode, promoting a competitive and efficiency economy and use of resources, and all this protecting the ecosystems, avoiding non-sustainable modes, promoting renewable resources, and minimizing the use of non-renewable energy sources, because we need to protect them and preserve them for future generations. Now, we might say, or rather, can we say that current mobility modes are sustainable now? Well, let's take a closer look at them, and let's do that in the framework of the European Union. Well, we'll draw a few comparisons with other states as well, but let's start from this area. As you can see from these charts, taken from transport in figures published by the EC with the most updated figures concerning mobility, so it shows that both passenger mobility and goods transport, you can see it in purple, grew from 1995 to 2019, i.e. in the past 25 years, at a pace which was more or less similar to that of GDP, that you can see in orange here. So if we take 1995 as 100, after 25 years GDP had grown by 50%. Well, mobility a bit less, 40% for passenger transport and 45% goods transport, and 35% passenger transport. So it was slightly slower than GDP, but it's more or less the same trend, more or less the same slope, with an interruption between 2008 and 2009 because of the major recession ensuing from the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy case that stabilized GDP and reduced goods transport till 2013. And then, with the economic recovery, goods transport and passenger transport resumed the same growth as GDP. So growth is more or less constant and it's very associated to economic trends. Now, let's go into the details of both. Let's take a look at the different transport modes. If we look at passengers, we can see that over 70% of passenger kilometers with this mode is related to road transport. So passenger transport by car. And that has continued to grow during this time period. All the other transport modes, buses, bikes, or the railways, air transport account for less than 10%. Their modal shares are much smaller. Air transport in the past 25 years grew more rapidly, especially following the growth of low-cost flights. The other transport modes remained more or less stable. Now, if we compare the European Union and other areas, well, we can find slight differences here. In the States, for instance, passenger transport still takes the lion's share, almost 80% in the past year. And take a look at China. The railways and also air transport account for a higher percentage compared to road. Let's move to goods transport. Here again, road transport with light commercial vehicles or heavy trucks takes the lion's share. And it's quite consistent, as you can see, except for the drop registered between 2008 and 2012. Now, sea transport reaches almost 30%. The other transport modes are smaller. Well, here again, if we look at the US and China, we can find some differences. In the US, the railways have a percentage almost as high as road transport. While it was more important, more significant in Europe in the past, but then it dropped. In the case of China, sea transport is the most important one, especially for goods transport. Now, we don't have the data for 2020 yet, and 2020 will certainly mark a strong discontinuity compared to that growth trend. Even more so compared to what happened in 2008, 2009, because of the financial crisis, and in this case because of restrictions, because of the lockdown and health crisis. Here are some Italian data. ISFO has already published the results of 2020. If we consider the number of trips for passengers, there was a reduction between 2019 and 2020 of about 20%. But if we also consider distance, reduction is about 40%. because of a reduction in the mobile population, in the percentage of people who move at least once a day. And more or less, well, here too, it had remained stable between 80 and 85%, and it dropped below 70%. That's not enough. Fewer people move, but they move fewer times a day and for a shorter distance. That justifies that 40% drop in mobility in Italy. We don't yet know about 2021, but apparently there has been a recovery, but we're still far from 2019. Now we can say that a model like this can be considered sustainable. Or rather, this is a question. Can it be considered sustainable? Well, let's take a look at its impact on the three previous dimensions and see if that impact is acceptable or not. Let's begin from the environmental dimension. Of course, moving requires energy, physical energy on foot or using a bike or fuels. If we look at the overall consumption of energy in the EU in 2019, we can see that over 30% of the total energy consumed can be traced back to transport. It's less than the residential sector, but it's about 30%, a very high share. And over time, it's growing. Energy consumption is growing because of an increase in overall mobility. And if we look at the various transport modes, we can see that road accounts for over 90% of consumption. So mostly road transport. Now, if the energy consumed by transport were renewable, well, it wouldn't be a big issue because we would leave future generations a stock of resources which is similar to the one we received. But unfortunately, this energy is mostly non-renewable. Of course, the share of renewable energy moved from 1% to about 10% in 2019, but it's still very low because 90% of the energy we consume is non-renewable. It's based on oil, petrol, etc. So when these resources are burnt by current engines, they deplete existing resources available for future generations. So that means that this model is not sustainable. Unfortunately, when we burn fossil fuels, engines generate gas emissions which have a further negative impact on the environment. There are two main types here. The first is that of CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, responsible for global heating and climate change. Well, it's not just due to transport. However, if we consider the various sources, we find that over 1/4 of CO2 emissions are due to transport. And that's not enough. All the sectors considered from 1990 to 2019 reduced their emissions except for transport, which instead registered a growth in CO2 emissions. In 2019, they were over 30% higher compared to 1990. And this is clearly an issue, since one of the pillars of the EU strategy is the reduction in CO2 emissions. Let's take a look at the various transport modes. over 70% of emissions can be attributed to road transport, followed by sea transport and air transport, which has more than doubled emissions in the past 30 years, whereas overall road transport and transport in general grew their emissions by 30%. How come? Now, if we look at average CO2 emissions of the new vehicles registered, in the past 20 years, car emissions dropped by almost 1/3 if we take each individual vehicles. However, if on the one hand we have more efficient engines with lower emissions, these vehicles have gradually increased the distance covered, their mileage, and this is partially neutralizing the advantages of technological evolution that made engines more efficient. Additionally, the combustion of fossil fuels in cars and other transport modes determines an increase in the emission of gases contributing to air pollution. I'm referring to VOCs, NOx, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and microparticles with a diameter lower than 0.5 microns. What is the impact of transport? Because other sectors too are characterized by these emissions. In the case of nitrogen oxides, over 50% of emissions are attributed to transport. That percentage drops down to 20% with carbon monoxide and PM 2.5, and then to a lower extent for sulfur dioxide and VOCs. Why is it an issue? Because these gases recombine in the atmosphere, causing acid rain, which have an impact on ecosystems, on crops, on the corrosion of monuments, of buildings. They cause tropospheric ozone with a further impact on the atmosphere. Now, if we consider maximum emission standards set by EU for vehicles sold in the EU, and if we compare the emissions of nitric oxides and PM10 generated by a Euro 1 engine, and here we have to go back to the early 90s, and if we compare them with current engines, Euro 6, starting from 2014, we can see that the new engines release much fewer emissions compared to Euro 1 at the beginning of the 90s, so technological evolution was massive. So emissions dropped by over 95%. However, the same challenge as for CO2 appears. Lower emissions are the case here again, in some cases 20%, 40%, 50%, but never 95%. Well, because of course it takes time before all the old models can be replaced with the new ones, but also because the total mileage has increased, and that's not enough. Also, the number of accessories in our cars which contribute to a consumption increase. Think of air conditioning, or think of navigation system. All these accessories make, of course, our trips more comfortable, but increase emissions, partly stultifying the advantages of technological innovation. Let's now move to the social dimension of sustainability, and let's begin to exposure to air pollution. Emissions have dropped, but they're still such that gas concentrations in the atmosphere exceed the maximum limits set by the EU to safeguard our health, because these gases have an impact on human health too, not just on the environment. And that's why we included it in the social dimension, because they damage our respiratory tract when we breathe them above certain limits set by the EU. Now, the first limit is that of the average annual concentration of nitrogen oxide that shouldn't exceed 40 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, in this map of 2017, you can see in red and dark red all the large cities with over 100,000 inhabitants in the EU where these 40 micrograms have been exceeded. And there's a concentration in the Padana Plain and in Central Europe, as you can see. The Padana Plain is possibly the most polluted area in Europe, Turin, Milan, Brescia, because of the morphology of this plain, which is surrounded by the Alps that break ventilation and recirculation of air, and therefore gas emissions, especially in cities, stagnate in the atmosphere and are not scattered away, if not when it rains or snows. If we look at PM10, the EU, in addition to that limit, also set a number of days, 35 days a year, when 50 micrograms per cubic meter shouldn't be exceeded. And here again you can see that the Padana Plain is one of the most polluted areas, and people are exposed to a very high number of days of pollution. In this case, not along with Central Europe, but with Eastern Europe. Now, this is very, very interesting. Well, we already have the data for Turin in 2020, both with respect to PM10 and NO2. Now, in 2020, when mobility dropped by 40%, the number of days when the maximum limit of 50 micrograms of PM10 were exceeded was higher, not just of the threshold set by the EU, 35 days, but here it's 80, 90 days. It actually exceeded the levels of the 2 previous years, and you might wonder how come? How is it possible? Well, it is possible because, as ARPA pointed out, the Environmental Protection Agency of Piedmont, as they highlighted, 2018 and 2019 had been more favorable because of rainy days and windy days that had helped scattering the higher concentrations because of the higher mileage. That's not enough. Most, the levels were exceeded before the pandemic in January and February. What happened starting from March? Well, mobility, of course, collapsed because people were locked in their homes. However, the emissions of PM10 due to heating increased because, of course, people were at home and they kept their heating system on all day long. And so the lower, let's say, transport pollution was replaced by a higher residential pollution. And then in April, when the heating systems were turned off, then emissions actually collapsed by 30-40% compared to April of 2019. So the impact of mobility reduction became finally clear. Now, if we look at nitrogen oxides, where contribution to mobility reaches 50%, well, you can see that in 2020 it was the lowest point compared to the early 90s. Well, just think about it. 30 years ago, we were between 220 and 250 days, so when limits were exceeded, not 35 days, 200, so almost 10 times as much. Well, the same applies to nitrogen oxides. The average is 40 and it was between 70 and 100. In 2020, albeit being less favorable in terms of rainy days and wind, that was the year with the lowest emissions in the past 30 years, although still in some cases higher than the 40 micrograms per cubic meters set by the EU. Now, what is the result of this exposure to air pollution? Well, over 300,000 people experience premature deaths because of PM 2.5 microns. Over 40,000 because of nitrogen dioxide, and almost 300,000 for tropospheric ozone. So there's an impact on health and a very strong impact on mortality. However, there's also another source of pollution ensuing from transport having a health impact. I'm talking about noise pollution. And here again, the impact of technological evolution was very strong, because compared to the 70s, where cars issue 90% less noise emissions, so above 50 kilometers an hour, well, noise is due to the rolling of tires on the pavement rather than being an intrinsic noise. Nonetheless, most people living in large cities are exposed to levels of noise which are dangerous for health, because above 55 decibels, that's the average exposure, damage, well, it's not permanent. You may be annoyed in your conversation, you may not being able to sleep or to study in a focused way. And especially just think about it when you're talking to somebody else. Yes, if you're trying to sleep, if you need a quiet environment. So above 65 decibels, however, there are hazards of permanent damage in terms of cardiovascular diseases. So the risk of damage, permanent damage. Now, if we look at EU data, well, this is the European Environment Agency, we can see that in the European continent as a whole, almost 50% of the population living in large cities are exposed to levels of noise above 55 decibels because of road traffic. Take a look at Italy. The percentage is even higher here. 2/3 of the people living in large cities are exposed to noise levels above 55 decibels for road traffic. And 1/3 of these 2/3 is exposed to a level above 65 decibels with the risks of permanent health damage. Even outside large cities, well, of course, the issue is there, although to a smaller extent. If we take Italy, along with Luxembourg, as you can see in black, over 12% living outside large urban areas are exposed to levels of noise exceeding 55 decibels because of road traffic. Maybe they live along motorway, for instance. And that means that in some cases, that challenge affects non-urban areas. If we consider also railway transport as well as air transport, well, here again, exposure to pollution is an issue, although to a lesser extent. In the case of Europe as a whole, it's about 5%. If we look at Italy, it's below 5%. And in the case of air transport, except for Luxembourg, of course, it's a very small country and most people live close to an airport, well, it's less than 5%. So as already happened for pollutant, climate change pollutants, here again, the issue lies in the prevalence of road traffic. Another type of social impact is associated to accidents. Let's compare road, railway and air fatalities. In 1990, the number of victims in road transport was 70,000, almost 80,000, including the UK. Then they gradually diminished. And 2019 shows that it's less than 1/3 compared to 1990. However, we still have 23,000 victims every year. Moving to railway fatalities and air transport, well, here we have a completely different magnitude. It's less than 100 units with a decreasing trend. So in 2019, we had 18 victims due to railway accidents. In the case of air transport, it's more volatile, but whether we consider air carriers in the EU, based in the EU, or air carriers leaving the European Union, the number of victims were equal to 0. So the issue is very much centered on road transport. And if we look at the main death causes in the EU, accidents rank 5th. We first have heart diseases, then cerebrovascular diseases, and then tumors and chronic respiratory tract diseases. And of course, air pollution has a strong impact. Accidents rank 5th with an incidence of 40 victims every 100,000 inhabitants. Much more compared to drug abuse, AIDS and alcoholism, which are often shown as social emergencies, cause a lower number of victims compared to road transport. So what does it mean, 23,000 victims due to road traffic in 2019? Well, it's the same number of people dying if that year 150 Boeing 737 had crashed with 179 seats occupied with about 100 passengers. And if all of them had died in the crash for 150 times per year, if we look at the number of serious injuries due to road traffic, well, it's 120,000 in 2019, and that is the equivalent of the number of serious injuries that we had if 278 high-speed trains in Italy had derailed and all the 432 passengers had actually been seriously injured during the accident. Well, just think about it. You read the news and read, a Boeing 737 crashed, 150 people died. And that happens 150 times a year, one every 2 days. And at the same time, 2 days out of 3, you read that 430 passengers of high-speed trains were seriously injured. Well, I wouldn't be very happy to get on a plane or on a train if I were to read that type of news almost every day. However, I get on my car with little worry, although the number of victims a year is similar to the imaginary situation we depicted. However, our perception of risk is completely different. So let me close the social dimension with another type of impact related to equity. Now, the pillar of the social aspect of sustainability is equity. So the absence of excessive discrepancies in access to environmental resources, a job, to access economic resources, and so on and so forth. Now, a system as the one I'm describing, mostly centered on road transport, is a system which actually discriminates against all those who cannot use a car because of the most different reasons. They might be younger than 18 or too old, or they may have some kind of physical, permanent or temporary disability. You may, break your leg, you can't drive, and you need somebody driving for you. Or people who, because of economic reasons, cannot afford to buy or use a car. So either the system is very balanced and offers the opportunity to move by car as well as move taking public transport means, in that case there's a compensation. However, if road transport is the prevailing mode, there is the risk that these people have lower access. It's less easy for them to access the various opportunities of social interaction far from home, which cannot be reached on foot or by bike or with the current transport vehicles. However, there's lack of equity also in terms of exposure to the negative impact of these transport modes. For example, small children are small and therefore they are closer to the, for example, vehicle mufflers, and they're exposed to a higher concentration of pollution. Or even the elderly, those who move on foot or by bike, they're exposed to a higher risk of serious accidents if they come into contact with a private car. So there's lack of the equity both in terms of access and in terms of the use of cars or vehicles by others. Well, the third is the economic dimension, and now I'm describing the negative impact on the environment, on the social sphere. But we'll see the economic consequences. That doesn't mean that transport doesn't play a key role in promoting access also to environmental resources and promote economic development too. Just think about it. 5% of GDP in the EU is generated by transport, and over 5% of jobs in the EU comes from transport. So jobs, job opportunities are created, wealth is created. However, there's a negative economic impact due to traffic congestion. The presence of traffic on the road that slows down the time required to reach your destination compared to the absence of traffic. This is the traffic index measured by TomTom globally in large cities. And it shows the congestion level, so the longer time required to move from A to B compared to the time required without traffic. And as you can see, Asian cities, Latin American cities experience the highest levels of congestion. In Europe, Bucharest is the most congested area, followed by Dublin, and finally by Rome, which is on an equal footing with Paris, Brussels and London. Well, the data go back to 2019. We have the data for 2020 in Italy, and you can see that there was a reduction, a significant reduction in congestion during the lockdowns. However, the wasted time percentage is about 20%. And all this has a negative impact on the economy. Of course, time is money. Time has an economic value. And if you're stuck in a congested road, of course, you are wasting time, a time that you could use in a more productive way, or it delays the delivery of goods, for example, with a number of negative consequences on competitiveness, as well as the economy. Now, the impacts I have shown can be measured with different measurement units, for example, CO2, or number of victims, or time wasted because of traffic. Now, there are methods of economic assessments translating all that into costs so as to make them comparable. Here we talk about external costs. What do I mean by that? When we move, we have to bear internal costs, and that happens directly. If I take my car, well, of course I had to buy that car or to pay the petrol required, and so my trip, I do pay a cost, and I pay directly. If I get on a bus, I buy a ticket, and I cover at least partly the cost of that. Well, this accounts for 70% of the cost of transport. However, the remaining 30% has an impact on society, also on people who never use a car, pollution, exposure to noise pollution, climate change, risk of accidents. Well, all this is borne by the entire community, not just by the people who are driving their car, for example. If costs were all internal costs, so we may not have to plan mobility. It would be a free market. Everyone would assess the costs they have to bear, the benefits, for example, to reach the shopping mall I want, or to reach university, to take part in a class, and you would be able to decide when and how to use a certain traffic mode. However, there are external costs too, and these costs are not directly borne by the traveler, and they do not have an impact on the decision to, let's say, take that trip or not. So they require public bodies to step in and contain these costs within tolerable and sustainable limits. Now, if we look at the translation into external costs, financial costs, we can see that total costs due to transport equal, without considering congestion. According to some, that's an internal cost. I'm traveling and I'm stuck and I am wasting time. According to others, according to the EU, they should also be considered external costs because they imply that because of my delay, because of my being stuck in traffic, I will not be able to reach my office. And if I arrive late at university, the other students will waste time uselessly. If a product takes too long to reach the supermarket, sooner or later, that transfer cost, additional transfer cost, will translate into a higher price to the detriment of consumers. Now, if we neglect traffic congestion and we consider accidents, pollution, climate change, noise, etc., total costs are equal to 4.8% of EU GDP. You might remember that transport generates 5% of wealth in Europe per year, but then that wealth is used to put remedy to the negative external impact generated by the transport mode. And if we include congestion, we come to 6.6 or 7%. If we analyze all the various impacts, overall accidents take the lion's share, almost 30%, followed by traffic congestion, air pollution, and climate change. Over 80% of the costs is due to road transport. Well, we had grasped it based on the impact analysis. Now, if we add all these costs up, we can see that over 80% is due to road transport. So that is the main cause of the non-sustainability of current transport systems. It's quite clear, as you can see in the chart. I'm separating passenger and goods transport, the incidence of road transport, and look at the external cost generated by transport modes. Well, it's followed by air traffic, and finally two-wheel vehicles, whereas buses and railway transport generate more limited external costs. If we look at goods transport and air transport, which is not that relevant in absolute terms on passenger traffic, so in terms of external costs, it's sea transport to be prevailing, followed by heavy vehicles, heavy trucks, as well as light commercial vehicles. I'm referring to minivans used for last-minute delivery, home deliveries. Now, if we consider not the total costs, but those standardized for the same distance covered, so in the sector of passenger transport, in this case, it's motorbikes with higher external costs, especially because of accidents or serious injuries, followed by cars. Whereas other collective forms of transport show smaller shares. In the case of goods transport, if we look at the individual kilometer, higher external costs are registered for heavy trucks, followed by internal river transport. Light commercial vehicles are not included because based on this manual and based on this recent EU estimate published by 2019, commercial vehicles are used both for passenger and goods transport. That's why the assessment was not based on passenger kilometer, but based on kilometers per vehicle or vehicle kilometers. So depending on how many people will travel in that vehicle, and understand also the cost of fuel. So it's about 24 cents per vehicle, almost as bikes. So these are highly polluting vehicles if not electric, if they burn fossil fuels. And this has an impact on the spreading out of online commerce and last-minute deliveries. Now, what are we supposed to do at this point? I hope it is clear that road transport is a priority if we want to reduce the impact of mobility systems on the three dimensions: economic, social, and health. Now, there's a certain amount of convergence, at least in Europe, on the so-called ASI strategy. The latter is expected to affect all the factors, or the negative factors for transport. So the acronym consists of three terms. First of all, avoid. We should try and avoid this constant increase in mobility, split it from GDP. Remember that there's a sort of pairing with the economy. We should, of course, grow our economies, but without growing mobility in parallel. Well, somebody might say, mobility is a right, you're not allowed to limit it. Well, actually, accessibility is certainly a right, so I must be able to access opportunities for social interaction in the area, but not move the way I want and anyway. I know that after 2 years of pandemic, this seems controversial, but of course, motory activities are allowed, moving on foot, moving by bike. Physical exercise is one thing. A different story is what kind of means of transport I want to use, how far a distance, so being able to choose without considering alternative means of transport. So the idea is to reduce the need for moving. That means affecting lifestyles, changing the shape of cities so as to avoid useless strips. For example, concentrating services around railway stations and not around motorways, so as to be able to access various functions without having to, cover long distances, because these centers are scattered all over. Now, once mobility is reduced without undermining access to mobility, or just containing especially motorized access, I have to promote a modal shift so as to shift from private means to collective means of transport, as well as to biking and going on foot, which do not require any fossil fuels. So that is tantamount to strengthening alternative mobility modes, for example, biking trails, raised pedestrian platforms to protect them when they cross the road, continuous lane networks for public transport so that they don't waste time at traffic lights. Rates should be consistent so that I don't have to change ticket every time I move from a train to a bus, for instance. So if we strengthen public transport and the accessibility of public transport, as well as disincentivating the use of private cars, either reducing available parking lots or increasing parking rates, for example, when I park my car along the road, along the street, or in parking lots, limiting access to roads near schools, for example, during certain times of the day, so as to protect the children, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, some transport will continue on private cars. Hence the third step, which is improve. So I should make sure that the means used for these trips become more efficient, consume less energy, consume fewer CO2, are less dangerous, not as SUVs. So I have to apply technological innovation so as to reduce the negative impact of these trips, which will continue to occur by private vehicles and by more collective vehicles, because obviously a certain amount of trips will still occur in private and individual means of transport, and therefore we should make sure that emissions as well as the external costs are reduced in this case, because just focusing on modal balance doesn't work. So these are three lines of action. They are interconnected. They should be complementary. That means that technological innovation plays a key role, but it should be matched by other policies impacting the very demand of mobility, so as to prevent what we experienced in the past 20 years when technological innovation improved the energy environmental efficiency of these vehicles. However, the increasing mileage, the use of high energy consuming accessories stultified, at least partially, the effects of technological innovation.